Good morning.
Morning.
I'm really excited to share my research with all of you. I'd like to start by thanking the CASBS administration and entire staff for providing us with the fantastic working conditions that we enjoy here. I'd also like to thank my fellow fellows with whom I have had the opportunity to exchange ideas over the past few months. It's an immense privilege to learn from you every day. This collaboration has been fundamental to the development of this project, which is still in its early stages. So I welcome any comments and questions after my presentation. The title, which is a little bit different from the program, is The Equality of All Bloods, World War II, Latin America, and US Hegemony. This photo is from a theatrical skit at a Brazilian student's demonstration in 1942. As you can see, the only black student was chosen to strangle Hitler. I will explain the concepts used in the title and the photos contest throughout the presentation. I'll begin by briefly mentioning some relevant aspects of my previous work. After that, I will discuss some aspects of the current project and conclude with reflections on how this research can help frame current political debates from a historical perspective. My doctoral dissertation, defended in 2001 and published as a book in 2004, focused on the reconfiguration of the working class between the 1920s and the 1950s in Porto Alegre, in southern Brazil, where I was born. I addressed classic topics in labor history, such as industrialization, urbanization, immigration, unions, and political participation. While researching, I made some surprising discoveries about the impact of World War II. The leading local industrialists were German Brazilians, and workers of European descent enjoyed a number of privileges. When German submarines sank Brazilian ships in 1942, there was a wave of street protests and strikes against Axis companies, clubs, and diplomatic missions. The German community, until then admired and influential, came to be suspected of collaborating with the enemy. Anti-Axis movements overcame the repression of the dictatorship ruling the country and paved the way for democratization in 1945. Between 2006 and 2021, I devoted most of my time to teaching and university administration, but gradually I expanded my reading on the global history of the Second World War and my archival research across various countries, often taking advantage of opportunities to participate in symposia and periods of vacation. I also published several articles and chapters in anthologies on the impact of World War II in Brazil. While presenting one of those papers at an online conference during the pandemic, I was invited by an editor called Macmillan to submit a book proposal, which led to the publication of The Second World War and the Rise of Mass Nationalism in Brazil in 2024. It examines how Brazil exploited rivalries among the great powers to secure economic deals that stabilized its economy after the Great Depression and to carry out strategic projects such as the construction of the National Steel Mill. It also shows how Brazil's joining the Allies strengthened the anti-fascist movement and contributed to the spread of the idea that it was a racial democracy. The war spurred recognition of social rights, but also intensified the repression of social movements considered a threat to national security. I opted to use mass nationalism rather than the traditional populism to analyze the transformations in the relationship between society and the state during that period. This was a conceptual innovation with significant implications, which we can discuss during the Q&A session if there is any interest. When I started working on my current project, my initial goal was limited to analyze the impact of World War II on Latin American nationalism by comparing Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. In recent months, the project has taken on a second dimension, the analysis of Latin America as a laboratory for the new international order that emerged from the war. The region barely features in the usual accounts of World War II, as it was largely spared combat and atrocities. But when we analyze the war as a process that led to the establishment of a new international order, Latin America takes on a different significance. Latin America experienced firsthand the development of the instruments of power projecting that would come to define U.S. global hegemony after 1945. In terms of hard power, they included the establishment of military bases, control over sources of strategic materials, and espionage networks of U.S. intelligence agencies. As for soft power, we have the good neighbor policy, the Pan-American organizations, and the development of new principles in international relations, such as collective security, which was later applied to NATO, for example. A century of experience in building post-colonial states made Latin American countries important models for the new and emerging nations of the second wave of decolonization, in what can be described as the post-war universalization of the nation state. Today, I will present some examples of how the transformation in ideas about race, national identities, and international relations that resulted from World War II are facets of the same process and how they affected Latin America. In 1943, several Brazilian newspapers published an open letter on their front pages in which U.S. Vice President Henry Wallace stated that the peoples of the two countries, after winning the war together, would continue to cooperate to create a world free from the specter of misery. Wallace praised Brazil's agriculture and industrial production, but the country's greatest contribution to the post-war world would be the proof that it's possible to achieve the genetic democracy, the process of racial mixing with recognition of the equality of all bloods. When Wallace wrote that Brazil and the US were fighting together, he was referring mainly to the economic cooperation and hemispheric defense. He also emphasized that it would bring a new world of democracy, economic development, and social justice. After the entry of the US and the Soviet Union in 1941, the war was increasingly seen as a conflict between fascism and anti-fascism. Brazil and the US, as members of the United Nations, were on the same side. The supposed Latin American racial equality stood in contrast to the doctrine of master races defended by the Axis. We don't have time to go into detail on Latin America's economic and geopolitical roles in the war, but I will briefly illustrate these factors as they explain the new significance the US attached to the region at that time. I have already mentioned Brazil's integration into the US war economy. This map provides an overview of the diversity of new fronts of work it created, bringing about significant change in the very composition of the Brazilian working class. In Mexico, the impact was even greater, including the supply of labor for agricultural work and for railroad construction in the US through the Braceiros program. This other map helps us to understand the geopolitical dimension. In the early 20th century, the US conceived its defense with a focus on naval protection of the continental territory. The prospect that aviation would play a central role in World War II led to the formulation of the hemispheric defense doctrine in 1938, which identified the proximity between northeastern Brazil and western Africa as the most vulnerable point in continental defense. 2 years later, with the Axis and Vichy France controlling North and Northwest Africa, the US established military bases in northern and northeastern Brazil, just a 4-hour flight from Senegal. Thus, the war economy demands and changes and strategic concepts increased the US interest in Latin America as a whole, differently from just thinking in terms of Central America and Mexico. But Wallace's message also implied that the war signaled the collapse of the existing international system and the clash between two radically different visions of humanity's future. At the top left, we see the world before World War I, in which a small number of empires, European empires mostly, controlled more than 8% of the Earth's surface, a scenario that to a large extent persisted into World War II. On the right, we see the current world with 193 sovereign states after a long and violent post-war decolonization. But the map below reminds us that we could be living in a very different world had the Axis new order prevailed. The Grand Alliance that reversed the decade-long trend of territorial expansion by the Axis powers began to take shape with the Atlantic Charter signed at a secret meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in August 1941. 9 months later, it became the United Nations Charter, signed by 26 countries and gaining growing support, leading up to the creation of the United Nations Organization in 1945. This document promised a post-war era of national self-determination, economic cooperation, and the advancement of social welfare, a world free from want and fear, as mentioned by Wallace in his message to the Brazilian people. But the United Nations was not merely a pact among leaders. Mobilizing the population in defense of principles considered politically and morally superior to those of the enemy was a fundamental part of the Allied strategy, driven by a symbol, the V for victory. Popularized in photos of great leaders, it was used in a wide variety of promotional materials, often associated with the opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which evoke the 3 dots and a dash that form the V in Morse code. As we can see in these photos of demonstrations in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, this symbol was also used in Latin America to express stances regarding the global conflict. This 1-minute newsreel about Mexico declaration of war on the Axis powers offers a glimpse of the era's atmosphere. The film depicts the protests sparked by the deaths of sailors returning from the sinking, resulting from the sinking of the oil tanker Protero de Lana by a German submarine. Mexico had been experiencing intense internal political conflict since the 1930s, but the Nazi aggression fostered an atmosphere of national unity. We can also see flags on display celebrating the United Nations and Pan-American unity. No. Not going.
Mexico City stages a giant demonstration for war. Thousands of citizens march to the capital's Central Plaza to urge action against the Axis. From his balcony, President Avila Camacho views this mighty demonstration of the will of the people. All parties unite as Mexico protests against Axis sinkings of unarmed Mexican ships. Flags of the United Nations wave in the square as survivors of the first torpedoed vessel salute their dead comrades. A man of action, Mexico's President Camacho takes his place on the rostrum before the Chamber of Deputies. He asks for a declaration of war. As radio carries his voice to the far corners of the Republic, the House of Deputies and the Senate vote unanimously for active participation in the conflict. Mexico, leader of Central America, new ally in the cause of the United Nations.
Okay, so that's the kind of thing that you could see at the time if you went to the movies to see Casablanca, for example. Before the movie, you see this kind of news. Okay, so this context of intense social mobilization linked to the dispute over the war's outcome and the nature of the post-war world had a major impact on debates regarding the relationship between race, the international order, and state building. In the early 20th century, so-called scientific racism played a fundamental role as an ideological justification for imperialism and class domination. Eugenic doctrines consider racial improvement essential for increasing nations' capacity to produce, reproduce, and fight. Social Darwinism preached that a strong race was a dividing line between national glory and extermination. World War II was, to a large extent, a result of those widespread ideologies. The Axis power justified their expansions by the need to conquer living space for the peoples. The Nazis studied U.S. segregation laws to construct a model of citizenship based on scientific races, systematizing the Nuremberg laws. The belief in a global Jewish conspiracy determined Germany's very strategy of war. The doctrine of the domination of master races was taken to the extreme to genocides and systems of slave labor. On the other hand, the reaction against the Axis conquests and atrocities linked anti-fascism and anti-racism and was made explicit in the US by the Double V campaign, victory in the war against fascism and domestically against racism. So the V took a new significance. But the US faced a major contradiction. As literary critic Waldo Frank pointed out in a 1943 Foreign Affairs article, the country had to face its failure in racial democracy. It could not even count on the full trust of Latin American nations as long as it continued to discriminate against a minority as significant as Black people, making them an inferior nation within another nation. Yet, while U.S. progressives such as Frank and Wallace praised Latin America as a positive example of racial issues, the reality of the region was more complicated. The appreciation of miscegenation and diversity was in fact recent and controversial. The Latin American independence movements of the 19th century coincided with the height of European power, reinforcing the idea that whitening was a prerequisite for earning the respect of the world's powerful and even for consolidating national sovereignty. The international turbulence of the early 20th century presented Latin American countries with risks, but also with significant opportunities. Pressures came simultaneously from above as a result of disputes among the great powers and from below, with the struggles of subaltern social sectors. In both cases, they demanded a reinvention of the nation state. The three largest Latin American countries differed greatly in demographic terms and underwent very different political processes in the period leading up to World War II. According to the classification developed by anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro, Brazil would be a new people marked by a mix of races and cultures. Mexico would be a testimony people, heir to pre-Columbian civilizations, and Argentina would be a transplanted people with a large proportion of European immigrants. Before 1930, the Brazilian oligarchic republic resisted change, while Mexico underwent a massive revolution and Argentina pursued political and social reforms. During the crisis that led to World War II, Brazil was under a personal dictatorship that lasted 15 years. Mexico consolidated a one-part system, and Argentina experienced profound instability. In terms of foreign policy, Brazil adopted pragmatic nationalism. Mexico allied itself with the United States to pressure other Latin American countries to join the allied cause, and Argentina remained neutral. But involvement in the war, in the process of building the new international order reinforced the similarities among the three countries' social political structures. They all consolidated in different ways mechanisms for incorporating workers into the political process and expanded social rights. Simultaneously, new racial myths emerged or took hold, expressing a process of reformulating national identities. Racial democracy in Brazil, the cosmic race in Mexico, and the little black rest, cabecitas negras, in Argentina. Let us look at some examples of how the global context of the war shaped debates on race on the three countries. So I focus on the racial thing. In Brazil, sociologist Oliveira Viana popularized the idea that the country's future depended on its Aryanization. In 1932, while as the top advisor to the Vargas government, he asserted that he considered the black race incompatible with civilization. Brazil's involvement in the war radically changed the landscape. In 1944, as the Brazilian Expeditionary Force prepared to face German troops in Italy, the ethnic and racial diversity of its soldiers was celebrated by the national press as proof that the country was a racial democracy and would teach racial democracy to the world. In Mexico, José Vasconcelos had already published La Raza Cósmica, The Cosmic Race, in 1925. His central thesis was that different races of the world tend to mix more and more until they form a new human type, a process that he considered to be at an advanced stage in Latin America. As the author later pointed out, this was a reaction against the influence of social Darwinism and Aryanism. During World War II, although Vasconcelos was in exile, the Mexican government official doctrine echoed his ideas. Writing in 1943, Foreign Minister Ezequiel Padilla denied the existence of fewer races and stated that history, that is, the imminent defeat of Nazis, had called into question the thesis that the destiny of people depends on the drops of Aryan blood flowing through their veins. In Argentina, the belief in racial purification proved more persistent. In 1945, when the Argentine government asserted that despite its neutrality, the country was collaborating economically with the defense of the continent, it emphasized that this was made possible by a population composed almost exclusively of white people. On the other hand, some leaders and ideologues of the nascent Peronist movement, which would come to dominate the country's post-war political history, emphasized that it represented a new working class composed of people of mixed and dark complexions, railing from rural areas and replacing the European immigrants of previous decades. Before concluding, I will mention two examples of how Latin American representatives linked the reconfiguration of their country's national identities to their actions within the new post-war multilateral system. In 1945, at the Assembly of the International Labor Organization, Mexican trade unionist Vicente Lobato Toledano stated that the combat had ended, but the struggle between two political theories behind the war would continue. The hegemony of a supposed race, superior race, versus the principle of popular sovereignty. In 1949, the Brazilian Arthur Ramos, the father of the concept of racial democracy, was appointed to head the Department of Social Sciences at the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, which had just been created. He launched a research program focused on the international fight against racism to help prevent future wars. In conclusion, I hope this presentation has demonstrated that racial equality and national self-determination are two sides of the same coin. The process of creating the United Nations raised hope for a world of peace, democracy, development, and social justice. Latin America was seen as a model for future decolonization, which would definitely transform the world's face. But this also challenged the region state to redefine their own national identities. Today, as recognized by the United Nations Secretary General on the organization's 8th anniversary in 2025, the post-war international order is facing its greatest crisis. Ethno-nationalism is re-emerging as a rising force in global politics. The world's richest man preaches that nations must maintain a common culture to survive. And the US Secretary of State refers to 1945 not as a victory for democracy, but as the beginning of the decline of the Western civilization. But struggles persist in defense of multiculturalism, the self-determination of peoples, and against racism. I don't know whether Bad Bunny was aware of the similarity between the parade of flags in his Super Bowl performance and those that expressed Pan-Americanism and support for the United Nations during World War II. Anyway, there are certainly principles and values that connect these historical moments separated by 8 decades and that need to be reclaimed and restored. Thank you. And since I still have time, I just say that those are Brazilian soldiers returning from the campaign in Italy, yeah, with a smoking snake made of papier-mâché.
We're going to do one question at a time, and I'm going to ask you on behalf of Alex to just think about not speaking quickly, to enunciate, and Rafa, first one is yours.
Thank you. You brought up multiculturalism, and you talked mostly about race and genetic democracy, and a little bit about multiculturalism. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what the role, like what happens with indigenous nations or ethnic groups or people, like beyond the sort of ethnic and racial factors, but the cultural factors in this nation building process.
You mean indigenous people in Latin America? Yeah, that's a big issue. I just yeah, at that moment, I would say it was not the central issue for those. Although in Mexico, it was part of this, the way in which they thought about the cosmic race, the indigenous peoples were central in that regard. But more, I would say maybe Mia's may probably say more than me about that, but more celebrated in discourses and representations than really granted with new rights and recognized more fully. But that's a talk that I still have to take a look at. I'm still more familiar with the Brazilian case, in which the Afro-Brazilian element in national identity was the central thing, at that moment. Yeah, but take note of that. Thank you, Jeff.
Lanier.
So this is sort of a direct follow-up. Could you say more about the amount of uptake or the lack of uptake of the Vasconcelos idea in the other two countries, that there would be this cosmic race, and that Latin America in particular would have this leading role in generating that in a sort of new world.
Mm-hmm.
How did the Brazilians and the Argentines respond to this sort of call for Latin America to become the new center?
Yeah. I would not say that Vasconcelos himself was very influential in Brazil, for example, and certainly not in Argentina. But the idea that mixing, could be a good thing, could be something positive, in some sense took shape in different ways in the three countries and more broadly in Latin America. But had different ways of was configured in different ways because of the differences among the countries. But one thing that's I would say that there was a lot of transnational connections going on, not only between the three countries, but also with the US. For example, cooperation between anthropologists, supported by the Office of Cooperation of Inter-American Affairs, run by Rockefeller, were very important at the time. And the influence of the concept of racial democracy, for example, has a lot to do with those like bringing people such as Gilberto Freire, Arthur Ramos to these speeches in Brazil, and also taking a guy like Waldo Frank, which I quoted, to Brazil. So there was a lot of, and it's interesting that even in 25, long time before, because it's complicated, I talked with Kunle about that. It was the idea of the cosmic race in Act was not new in the 40s, was from 25, But what I try to show is that it became more influential in foreign policy, for example, during the war, because it made a lot of sense if you go to war against the Axis, to claim that you are, the birthplace of a new mixed race that will reshape humanity's future. And one interesting thing, even in 1925, was that Vasconcelos wrote about the cosmic race after a trip to Brazil and Argentina. He even mentions that on the subtitle of his book, So the idea, which people are thinking from their national environments, but also with connections to the other Latin American picture. I think that's important.
Kunle.
Thank you. This is great. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
I've always found curious because it was one of the only, maybe the only Latin American country that stayed neutral, after the independent countries that stayed neutral during World War II. And I'm wondering if this neutrality during the war may have contributed to lower levels of kind of national mobilization in ways that enabled ideas of whiteness and white supremacy to persist longer. Like I'm kind of thinking about this in the sense that this was a place that hosted a lot of escaped Nazis for years after the war. And it's also the only Latin American country that I'm aware of that removed Black people as a category from from census records in the late 19th century. Yeah, a little bit on.
Well, Brazilians are not neutral when they speak about Argentina. so I have to be open about that. No, but in fact, all those countries are racist countries. I think it's important to say that. I'm not talking about reality. I'm talking about national myths of, about identity that took shape. Of course, but on the other hand, I would say that the change from an intellectual and political environment that was entirely dominated by eugenic ideas and racial, so-called scientific racism, to those discourses, nationalist discourses connected to the ideas that, being part of a multicultural, mixed race country may be a good thing in this new world that is emerging. Of course, I think that was an important change. On people from, like, for example, people from the Black movement in Brazil, they will say, that just uncovered racism, structural racism for a long time, and that's true. That's also true, I'd say. So I have two sides. So back to Argentina, it's really, as I try to say, it's hard to say what is the cause and what is the causal direction of the relationships, but neutrality and this idea that we are an almost European country and we don't want to get involved in this kind of alliance was a thing. The other thing was that the Argentine nationalists, they had a harsh experience with British imperialism. They just didn't want to replace British imperialism with American imperialism through this idea of following American leadership. The rivalry with Brazil also explained neutrality, because in Brazil, but neutralism was also very strong in Brazil until Pearl Harbor. That is, after Pearl Harbor, it was a matter of time that Brazil would join the Americans, because the pressure on one hand and the concessions, economic offers that the West made, which were very attractive for Brazil, very interesting for Brazil, combined it, to produce this move. But among the Brazilian military, the idea of keeping neutral was strong until a certain point. And in Argentina, it prevailed for more time. And racism, I think, this strength of the self-identification of the Argentines with the idea that they are the white people in Latin America, it's something that we still can see in place today. We have a lot of incidents happening with Argentine tourists in Brazil. Recently, one of them spent time in jail for things that they think are not big deal in Argentina, but which in Brazil are criminalized as racism. So that we can keep talking about that.
Okay. Wen-Chin.
Well, I wonder what's the role of nationalism, because I know in some countries in Latin America, economic equality is a serious issue, and it seems that it's missing in your talk. Yeah.
Racial equality.
Economic equality.
Oh, economic. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm trying to do, I focused on the racial thing because race really, as I tried to explain, became a central issue in this expansion of this alliance from the two initial partners, like the British Empire and the US, to the United Nations. One of the things to make the contracts with the Access Force was to say we are anti-racist, and that was deeply connected to defending, the universalization of self-determination, which of course was a big problem, particularly for the British Empire. But they had no other choice left at that moment. So that ceremony of signing the Atlantic Charter can be also as a kind of surrender of Britain to this new order. It was clear that the empire would not survive after that. But going back to so the connection between, I would say that class, which links to economic inequality, kind of took second place compared to race in that time. Race became the big center, but it was deeply connected, because in fact, even going back, there's an important thing about Argentina that I didn't mention, which is the fact that even as this idea that Peronism, which emerged at the end of the war, represented not only a new working class, but a darker working class, a native working class, which was not as European as the previous one that were under anarchist and anarchic syndicalist influence, or socialists in the early decades of the century. And also this was a new working class and a darker working class, and supposedly more national working class than the immigrant previous one. But even Perón did not embrace this concept of, my followers are the cabecitas negras. That was mostly what his oppositors would say. But part of the Peronist movement embraced that idea, but not necessarily. You would not find any discourse by Perón himself saying, "Oh, we are." No, he would say, my followers are the descamisados, which means shirtless people, so people, so poor people, the poor segments of the working class are supporting him. So he would not frame in racial terms. And he was a military, formed very strong in the military schools under eugenic doctrines, and he was before being a national leader in politics, he was a military attaché in fascist Italy. So he had a lot of connections to the doctrines of the Axis. I'm not saying he was a fascist. There's a huge debate about that, but even at the time, I think one of the things that I presented mentioned that, it's a lot of things. I don't know if I answered any of your questions.
Is it Carolina?
Yeah.
Alex, thank you very much for this talk. It was very, it was very exciting to see you connect so many things here. I love seeing the connections between the Brazilian, even though you didn't really go into that, the Brazilian economy into the world, into the war efforts, and put it in discussion, race in Latin America. With what's going on in the world, right? And I find this movement very interesting for Latin America because you have, on the one hand, you have many populist governments that are seeking to integrate these people that is of mixed colors, right? Like Black, Indigenous, and then any sort of mixes that you have there. But at the same time, there's also clear efforts, for example, in the case of Argentina, and I can think of situations in Colombia too, where they talk about cabecitas negras, Black people, right? It's like we include them for political purposes and sometimes push them away. At the same time, which is something I really like seeing here, is how they are creating this sense of nation, right? So for me, I wanted to ask you, because they're talking about the integration of races, but at the same time, yes, there are moments where they reject the I'm going to call it blackness, right? But it's the darkness of skin. But this is also an interesting moment because you have immigrants, Syrians, Lebanese, when several countries were called Turks, right? And also Jewish people coming to Latin America, or trying to come into Latin America. And you have all this foreign ministers that are putting quotas, for example, saying, we're not receiving these people. The notion of church, right? For example, 1930, I think it was 1940, there was a candidate of Sierra Lebanese descent. And the conservative, he was liberal, and the conservative press went against him, and they were calling him a Turk, calling him Muslim. There's even a photo, how do you call it? Like a fake photo, trying to link him with governments in the Middle East. So that's one. And two, I mean, I'm sorry, this is very exciting. And then, because I was looking at your slide about foreign politics, right? US in this zone of influence. I'm wondering if you're looking at the connections. I guess I know this is post-war period, but all these connections between Nazis that come to Latin America that then end up being key in Cold War politics and in the Condor operation, right? Because it's really striking, right? Like, the US being against Nazis, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're embracing all your techniques for people and disappearing people.
So immigration was a central issue, and of course, all the changes that happened during that time impacted immigration policies, but in a very complicated way, I'd say. So in Brazil, this guy that I mentioned that was made the idea of Aryanization popular in the country, he was an advisor in policies, mostly in labor and immigration policies, you know? And so they have been since the end of slavery in Brazil in 1888, you know, bringing white people, European preferentially, you know. We had some also important Japanese immigration as well, and the Japanese faced a lot of discrimination and a hard time. So for the Japanese, for example, the persecution during the war just added to the previous persecution. The big change happened with the Italians and mostly the Germans, because the Germans were very successful, affluent, were seen as a great, you know. So, but then people said, you know, we don't have only to think about improving the race, which of course it's good, you know, but we also have to think to take more care with assimilation because of national security. And so this tension between, you know, whitening and assimilation and national security was complicated in order to define which were the immigration policies to be implemented and put in place. So the Syrian Lebanese in Colombia are the origin of Shakira, for example. This is a great contribution to humanity. I should add Shakira with Bad Bunny. But that makes sense. And maybe Chris and I will see Carlos Vives in New Orleans, by the way. But one example of how complicated it was, you know, was that there were a lot of, there's a huge bibliography on that, you know, Jewish people applying for visas to migrate to Brazil after the war, you know, in the end of the war and after the war. And the Brazilian government, those guys, of course, were also anti-Semitic, you know. So on the other hand, Brazil played an important role at the UN in the creation of the state of Israel, which in some sense are not disconnected things, you know. It was good. We have to find a home for those people so they are not coming in huge numbers because they don't fit exactly, or so they may be helpful in some sectors, but so it was not the same kind of anti-Semitism that they would face in other places here in Europe. It was not so strong, not so violent, but it was there and it shaped policy. And you would even find people denouncing Brazil. Brazil is a supposed racial democracy, but it's creating difficulties for Jewish people to immigrate after, you know, the Holocaust and everything that people learned about at the end of the war. So the ways in which those things interacted is really complicated.
Okay, Corey.
So, as I'm understanding the talk, you're saying that there's a post-World War II world where around race, the nation, and international relation are different.
Mhm.
And that Latin America is a nice sort of test case for that and representative
Mhm.
of those changes. And I think that's awesome. So yeah, great job. But I'm curious as to, is there something special about Latin America that makes it a good illustration of these shifts?
Yeah.
Shouldn't we have seen these same, or can we imagine that these same sort of things manifest in other parts of the world, right? Because if it's like
Mhm.
nation state shit is different now, that should have been emerging everywhere. So I guess I'm wondering,
Yeah.
is it more obvious in Latin America because maybe it's like racially diverse in ways that Africa or Asia weren't? Or yeah, so I don't know. So I'm asking,
Mhm. Mhm.
I buy everything you're saying. Is this also happening in other parts of the world?
Yeah. So, remember the first map that in that slide with 3 maps. The first one was the world after the First World War.
Yeah.
So the Americas, the American continent was the only part of the world in which you had. Let's put it differently. The center of power in the 19th century in the world was in European nation empires, which were at the same time nation states and controlled huge empires. And as what happened in the American continent is that you had the US rising, became a great power, but even the US was created by an anti-colonial movement, originally. Some people forget about that sometimes. So the US would never became a dominant power in the globe, running over a system of empires. The very emergence of the US as a new hegemon after the war bring up the necessity of even, and also the axis was basically the attempt to create 3 new empires, which with a different understanding about reshaping zones of influence in the world, So what was at stake in the war, in certain sense, was that it became, after the US took the lead of the United Nations, the very idea of the United Nations, the idea that, as you see today, the world would be entirely covered by sovereign nation states. And the only part of the world which was not composed by empires and big and great powers, and had more than 100 years of experience of building sovereign, political sovereign, but economic independent nation states, which became the norm after the war, was Latin America. So it's not only one case. Is as I said, the result of the first wave of decolonization, which was limited in scope, even because it happened against the decay in empires, which was not the case with what happened with the second wave of decolonization. So that's why it was so violent, after the war. But so I'd say after the United Nations was created, the principle of a world of empires and colonies had been defeated. But putting that in place as a general project was a long and violent process. But yes, what I'm trying to say is that the US needed the Latin American experience, or even these ideas about how to create sovereign states in the post-colonial world. Latin America was the only place to take that experience and to make the case that could be the basis for a new global order. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sound.
This is fascinating. I'm writing a book on how politics and soldiers come home, so forgive that slightly selfish. I'm very taken by particularly by the picture that you show right now. And
So one question, set of questions I have. One is, is there any evidence that the soldiers who were sent from Brazil changed their attitudes towards democracy or racial?
Oh, yeah.
Is there any evidence that they had impact when they came back? Did they assume any leadership positions, or was it sort of kind of more dispersed? I'd love to hear what happened.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. The funny thing is that usually when people learn that I'm doing research on Brazil and the Second World, the first thing that they think is about the Expeditionary Force, because everything, more than 90% of the works, academic works done, research done on Brazil and the Second World, focus on those 35,000, one division that Brazil sent, which is a tiny number of, it's a small troop. But it was very important for Brazil to, as they used to say at the time, take a seat at the winner's table. It ended up that just economic cooperation was not, and bringing new principles about nation state and race and so on was not enough to be considered seriously as one of the winning. And what was at stake at the moment still is Brazil wanted a seat at the UN Security Council. Didn't happen yet. And maybe it's easier to close the United Nations than to get a seat. But they were considered this experience was seen as something very dangerous by the military commanders in Brazil, which were formed in a very authoritarian and hierarchical tradition. And this is the kind, as they said in England in the 16th century, new model army. This force was created in a very different way and was trained to fight under U.S. command, not following the traditional Prussian or French doctrines. And there was a small segment of communists that volunteers to go to war and made a lot of agitation among the troops. And they experienced, they had a lot of connections with the Italian partisans when they were in Italy. So what happens that they were demobilized, discharged before coming back to Brazil. So at that moment they were returned, they were not part of the Brazilian army anymore. It was just an experience for that specific moment. But yes, that had, and the debates about sending the troops, what that means, and how we are going to rethink our defense after they come back. A lot of people would say, no, this can be the embryo for a new vision about the armed forces and defense, but that didn't happen.
Okay, I think that maybe Data Circ has a follow-up. Is that what
follow
you're
up
saying?
to Corey's.
All right, we'll go for it. Here, you've got the floor now.
I heard Corey's question, but I understood the problem a little bit differently. So, Alex, your study is about the role of Brazil in the fight against ethno-nationalism in the 1940s. That's how I heard it. And given your conclusion, I would want to ask you, what is the lesson? What are the lessons from your study for the current moment? So much has changed. We saw in this movie the American flag and other flags. And now the moment in which we're living is one in which the United Nations is also taking action against ethno-nationalism. A whole series of resolutions against ethno-nationalism in which the United States and Israel and a few other countries, just a handful, have voted against those resolutions. So my question is, what is the role of Brazil today? What would your study sort of point to the lessons that you could learn from the previous epoch for today?
Yeah.
In just a couple sentences.
Well, it's not only Brazil, it's Latin America. And I think, for example, I see in the present, Mexican presidency, it's very important today to have, for example, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia under progressive presidents and acting together to try to resist against the kind of new intervention that the Trump government is opposing. One thing that I would say is that although we know that we cannot believe at face value those discourses about self-determination and being part of the United Nations as all nations being equal, is still worth fighting for those principles, and it's very important. And it's very important to understand what these guys are doing right now, because when they are undoing the international system, they are opening the way for a world in which racism and all kinds of violence and discriminations can run freely without any constraint. So that's what I see. So when I mention Rubio and Musk, I would say those guys are really, I would not say they're exactly the same kind of fascists but and on the other hand, you can see how culture and cultural expressions is important to resist. So that's why I picked Bad Bunny, for example. I picked out because I didn't mention, but the other the picture that I combined with Bad Bunny was the Mexican people, Mexican cinema workers, actresses and actors and directors and filmmakers, parading with the flags of the American nations. So that's the kind of connection that I'm trying to bring along.
So let's do what we did at the end of Saunders Talk, and we'll take a few questions and not allow you to answer, but we'll then have them for you to think about later.
Okay.
Let's do Pauline and then Miros.
More about Latin America as a testing ground for U.S. power projection, and I think it's very much related to Corey's question. In some ways, your answer to Corey's question was my question, which is how does the projection of hard and soft power by the U.S. as a result of the war affect the way that these norms and ideals get transmitted? The norms and ideals about racial equality and multiracial democracy and self-determination to Latin America, and how is that distinct from other parts of the world? Because it's not the same power projection. It's not the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Miros.
Thank you. Really impressive. 3 regions with very complicated histories to try to sort of understand. So I was just kind of wondering about, because I don't know as much of the full detail of this, all the things you're talking about, like this framing that you have with these 3. It's probably because of my ignorance. The framing here, is that what you're bringing that's new to the literature? Like, I want to understand, like, what are you adding to these bigger debates? Is that because you're like giving this over what you're doing, and so I'm thinking like, oh, is this what is the impact of your work? That's what I just. But yeah, it's very, and I think this is about the making of national identities, right? That's what.
Okay, we're gonna squeeze a couple more in. Aaron and Ellen.
Oh, I was really interested in the Henry Wallace op-ed at the beginning of the piece, and of course, was struck by the fact that he didn't make it to the next FDR term, and also at the same time that he wrote that Japanese Americans were in internment camps, and so obviously America is going through a struggle at the same time the countries in your study are going in a struggle, and I was interested in learning more about parallel struggle and the alignment of the
Of course, beautiful pictures. I'm going to channel the people that talked about Holocaust and post-war integration and immigration. I wanted you to think about, or I wondered, it was very about plurality of religion and support across Catholicism, Judaism, other world religions, because race, the war involves religion as well. So I would think that intersectionality, I was curious about that. The people that weren't let in, I know some people that tried to, their family tried to immigrate to Argentina. Somebody in Louisville, Kentucky sponsored them, so they never came. And I also think the term white versus other groups, European white is not a monolithic group, really. There's the poor Eastern European groups that didn't come. So I was just thinking about that for language as an idea to help understanding.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes. Let's squeeze 2 more in, but it means you have to stick with 1 minute per question for Deepa and Ron.
This is all really fascinating, and I don't want to add another country to these complex, as Miros pointed out well, very rich and robust that you already have. But I just couldn't help but making comparisons in my own head. And I know it's not Latin America, but it's the Caribbean to Cuba, which is not obviously a democracy, but what Cuba has achieved in terms of kind of moving from ethno-nationalism to a much more racialized populace. And I think it goes to Wen Chin's comment, because it was based on class and really building in equal access to every opportunity that exists, so that you get to a point where in your populace, you know, you have your doctor is a Black woman. Your, you know, in all throughout society, it's the integration of the races is much more based on your everyday life, and breaks down the inequality in that way. Anyway, it just seemed like it might be an interesting example to think through.
Okay, Ron, try for 30 seconds.
I would ask you.
Okay, yeah, all right, okay.
Okay. Yeah.